The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the Texas hills when Rebecca wiped the sweat from her forehead. It was going to be another scorching day, and she wanted to get the washing done before the heat became unbearable. Her small cabin sat alone in a valley, surrounded by nothing but tall grass and the occasional oak tree. The nearest neighbor was 2 days' ride away, which was exactly how she liked it. 6 months had passed since she buried her husband Thomas behind the cabin. Fever had taken him during the harsh winter, leaving her to work the small farm alone. Some folks back in town thought she was crazy for staying out here by herself. A woman alone on the frontier? It wasn't natural, they said. But Rebecca had grown up tough, and she wasn't about to let anyone tell her what she could or couldn't do. She hung Thomas's old work shirt on the line, the fabric still smelling faintly of the lye soap she'd made last week. The creek bubbled nearby, providing the water she needed for washing and the music that kept her company during the long, quiet days. Sometimes she talked to herself just to hear a human voice. Sometimes she talked to Thomas, pretending he was still there to listen. Chloe's basket sat heavy in her arms as she bent to pick up another wet sheet. That's when she heard it, a sound that made her freeze completely. It was weak, almost like a kitten crying, but different, more desperate. It was coming from down by the creek, maybe 50 yards away where the cottonwood trees grew thick. Rebecca set down the basket and listened harder. There it was again. Definitely human, definitely young, and definitely in trouble. Her heart started beating faster. Out here, strange sounds usually meant danger. Could be Indians. Could be outlaws. Could be wild animals. Thomas had always told her to trust her instincts. And right now her instincts were screaming at her to get back inside the cabin and bolt the door. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and something deep in her chest tugged at her. It sounded like a child. She looked back at her cabin, then toward the creek. The sensible thing would be to ignore it. Mind her own business. Stay safe. But Rebecca had never been particularly sensible, and the cry was getting fainter. If someone was hurt down there, they might not last much longer without help. Against every bit of common sense she possessed, Rebecca walked toward the sound. She moved carefully, stepping over fallen branches and pushing through the tall grass that grew along the creek bank. The cottonwoods provided good cover, but they also meant she couldn't see very far ahead. Every step felt like a gamble. The crying stopped suddenly, and Rebecca froze. Had whoever it was heard her coming? Was this some kind of trap? Stories filled her head, tales of Indian raids, of settlers who'd been lured away from safety and never seen again. Her mouth went dry, but she forced herself to keep moving forward. That's when she saw him. A boy, maybe 12 years old, lay pinned beneath a fallen cottonwood branch. His dark skin and long black hair told her immediately what. He was Comanche, the enemy. The same people who'd been raiding settlements all up and down the frontier. The same people her own husband had fought against before his death. But looking at him now, all she could see was a child in pain. The boy's shoulder was bleeding badly, a deep gash that had soaked his buckskin shirt with blood. His left leg was twisted at an angle that made Rebecca's stomach turn. He'd been trying to free himself from the branch, but he was too weak now. His dark eyes fixed on her face, and she saw something there that surprised her. Not just pain and fear, but intelligence. And maybe, just maybe, hope. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Rebecca knew what everyone back in town would say. Indians were dangerous. They were killers. They couldn't be trusted. Just last month, the Johnson family had been attacked. 3 dead, including little Mary Johnson, who was only 8 years old. But this wasn't a warrior. This was a boy who looked like he was dying. The child tried to say something in his own language, his voice barely a whisper. He pointed weakly at his trapped leg. Rebecca didn't need to speak Comanche to understand what he was asking for. Help. She looked around nervously. Where there was one Indian, there were usually others. But the woods were quiet except for the normal sounds of birds and flowing water. If this boy had been traveling with others, They were long gone. Maybe they thought he was dead already. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Storm clouds were building up to the west, dark and threatening. If she left him here, the rain would finish what the fallen tree had started. The boy would be dead by morning. Rebecca made her choice. She knelt beside the fallen cottonwood and examined the situation. The branch wasn't huge, but it was heavy enough to pin the boy's leg. His shoulder wound was bleeding steadily, and his breathing was shallow. She needed to work fast. "I'm going to help you," she said softly, not sure if he understood English, but hoping her tone would calm him. "But I need you to stay still, okay?" The boy nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. Rebecca braced her back against a larger tree and pushed against a fallen branch with her legs. She'd grown strong from months of farm work, but it still took everything she had to live. It enough for the boy to pull his leg free. He cried out in pain as he moved, but he managed to drag himself clear without the branch holding him down. Rebecca could see that his leg was definitely broken. Not a simple break either. This was the kind of injury that could cripple a person for life if it wasn't set properly. The shoulder wound was deep, but not immediately life-threatening. If she could stop the bleeding. The first fat raindrops started falling as Rebecca helped the boy sit up. He was lighter than she'd expected, probably from loss of blood and not eating. When she slipped her arm around his waist to support him, she could feel him trembling. "Can you walk at all?" she asked, then realized how stupid that sounded. Of course he couldn't walk with a broken leg. Instead, she managed to get him onto her back. He was heavier than he looked, and the walk back to the cabin felt like it took forever. By the time they reached her door, both of them were soaked from the rain that had started falling in earnest. Rebecca kicked open the cabin door and carried the boy inside. She laid him down on Thomas's old blanket near the fireplace, where the light was best. The boy's eyes had closed, and for a scary moment she thought he might have died. But when she touched his forehead, he opened his eyes and looked at her. Again, now came the hard part. Rebecca had some experience with doctoring. You had to live in this far from town. She'd set Thomas's broken arm once, and she stitched up plenty of cuts over the years. But this was different. This wasn't her husband or a neighbor. This was a Comanche boy, and if anyone found out what she was doing, there would be hell to pay. But as she looked down at his young face, pale from loss of blood and tight with pain, Rebecca knew she'd made the right choice. She couldn't save everyone, couldn't stop the fighting between the settlers and the Indians, couldn't bring back all the people who died on both sides. But maybe, just maybe, she could save this one. Boy Dot, and sometimes that had to be enough. Catherine's hand shook as she lit the oil lamp and carried it closer to where Ayanna lay. The flickering light made the cabin feel smaller somehow, more intimate and dangerous at the same time. Outside, the storm was getting worse. Wind howled around the corners of the little house, and rain hammered against a single window like someone trying to get in. She knelt beside the boy and carefully examined his wounds in the better light. The shoulder gash was worse than she'd first thought, deep enough that she could see muscle underneath the torn skin. It needed stitching, and soon, or he'd keep bleeding until there was nothing left to bleed. His broken leg was swollen now, the skin tight and discolored. She'd have to set it properly, or he'd never walk right again, if he lived long enough for that to matter. Ayanna's eyes followed her movements as she gathered her supplies. William's old medical kit sat on the shelf where she'd left it after his death. Needle and thread, a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds, clean rags torn from old sheets. Not much, but it would have to do. The nearest real doctor was 3 days' ride away in good weather, and in this storm, it might as well be on the moon. "This is going to hurt," she told him softly, holding up the needle so he could see it. "But I have to stop the bleeding." Ayanna nodded, understanding more than she'd expected. His dark eyes were alert despite his pain, watching everything she did with the careful attention of someone who'd learned early that missing details could mean death. Catherine cleaned the needle with whiskey, then poured some of the burning liquid directly onto his shoulder wound. Ayena's body went rigid and his teeth clenched, but he didn't cry out. Not even a whimper. The kind of self-control that impressed her and broke her heart at the same time. What kind of life had this boy lived that taught him to suffer in silence? Like that, she began stitching, working by lamplight while the storm raged outside. Her hands were steadier now that she had something to focus on. Each stitch had to be perfect. Too loose and the wound wouldn't close properly. Too tight and it would tear when he moved. Ayana watched her work, occasionally saying something in Comanche under his breath. Whether he was praying or cursing, she couldn't tell. "You're very brave," she said as she tied off the last stitch. "Braver than most grown men I know." The boy looked puzzled for a moment, then seemed to understand the tone, if not all the words. He said something back in his own language, then struggled to find English words. "You ... good. Thank you." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes. When was the last time anyone had thanked her for anything? Living alone out here, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be needed by another person. Now came the harder job, setting his broken leg. She'd done it once before with William, but that had been a simple break in his forearm. This was different, more complicated, more dangerous. If she did it wrong, the boy might never walk again. If she didn't do it at all, he definitely wouldn't. She gathered straight pieces of wood from her kindling pile to use as splints, then tore more strips from an old sheet to bind them with. Ayana watched her preparations with growing understanding of what was coming. His face went pale, but he nodded when she looked at him questioningly. "This will hurt worse than the stitching," she warned him. "A lot worse. Do you understand?" "I understand," he managed in careful English. Catherine positioned herself at his feet and gently felt along his injured leg, trying to figure out exactly where the break was. Ayena's breathing got faster, but he stayed still. When she found the spot where the bone was displaced, she looked up at him. "Ready?" He nodded and gripped the edge of the blanket with both hands. Catherine pulled steadily on his foot, while pushing the displaced bone back into position. This time Ayana couldn't stay silent. A low groan escaped through his clenched teeth, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. But the bone clicked back into place with a sound that made both of them wince. Working quickly, before the pain could overwhelm him completely, Catherine splinted the leg with the wooden strips and bound it tight with cloth. Not pretty, but it would hold the bone in place while it healed. If it healed, if infection didn't set in first. If a dozen other things didn't go wrong. When she finished, Ayana had passed out from the pain. Catherine checked his breathing and found it steady, if shallow. She covered him with William's old coat and sat back on her heels, suddenly exhausted. What had she done? The reality of her situation hit her all at once. She had a wounded Comanche boy in her cabin. Not just any wounded boy, one who belonged to a tribe that had been raiding settlements all along the frontier. His people would be looking for him. And when they didn't find him, they'd assume he was dead. But what if they did find him? What if they tracked him here? Catherine got up and walked to the window, peering out into the storm-dark night. She couldn't see anything beyond the sheet of rain, but that didn't mean nothing was out there. Comanche warriors were famous for moving without being seen, for appearing where you least expected them. How many stories had she heard of families who went to bed feeling safe and woke up to find painted faces staring down at them? She thought about Jake Morrison's warning. "They're animals," he'd said. But looking at Ayana sleeping peacefully by her fireplace, she couldn't see an animal. She saw a hurt child who'd said thank you in broken English. A boy who'd endured having his legs set without screaming. Someone's son missing from his family tonight. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it was getting worse. Thunder crashed overhead, and lightning lit up the cabin in brief, stark flashes. Catherine made coffee and sat in her rocking chair, watching Ayana sleep and trying to figure out what to do next. She could still change her mind. Wait for the storm to pass, then load him onto her horse and take him somewhere far from her cabin. Leave him where his people might find him, then wash her hands of the whole thing. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice. But every time she considered it, she remembered the way he'd looked at her when she first found him. That flicker of hope in his dark eyes. The trust he'd shown when he let her treat his wounds. How could she betray that now? Hours passed. Catherine dozed fitfully in her chair, starting awake every time the wind made the cabin creak or the fire popped in the fireplace. Around midnight, Ayanna stirred and opened his eyes. For a moment he looked confused, probably wondering where he was. Then he saw Catherine and relaxed slightly. Water? He asked in careful English. Catherine brought him a cup of water from her bucket and helped him drink. His fever had broken while he slept, which was a good sign. The color was coming back to his face, and his breathing was stronger. How do you feel? She asked. Ayana considered the question, probably translating it in his head. Hurt, he said finally. But better, thank you. There it was again. That simple gratitude that cut right through all her fears and doubts. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm. Catherine found herself studying his face in the firelight. He was younger than she first thought, probably closer to 11 than 13. Still just a child, really. Someone who should be safe with his family instead of lying hurt and alone in a stranger's cabin. Your family, she said slowly, pointing to him and then making a gesture that she hoped would convey the idea of other people. Are they looking for you? Ayanna's face grew sad. He said something in Comanche, then struggled to translate. They think. I dead. Storm. River high. Horse scare. Threw me. I fell. He pointed to his head, then his leg. So that was how it had happened. A spooked horse, a bad fall, maybe knocked unconscious and swept downstream by the flooding creek. His hunting party had probably searched as long as they could, then given up when the storm got too bad. They go home thinking he drowned, which meant nobody was looking for him. At least not right now. Catherine made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. You can stay here until you're healed, she said. But you have to understand something. If other white people find you here, we'll both be in terrible danger. Do you understand that? Ayanna nodded solemnly. I understand. I will be careful. Good. Catherine stood up and added another log to the fire. Try to get some more sleep. You need rest to heal. As she settled back into her rocking chair, Catherine realized she'd just committed herself to something that could get her killed. She was harboring the enemy in her home, treating him like family, risking everything for a boy she'd known for less than a day. But for the first time in months, she didn't feel alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth the risk. Catherine woke to the sound of birds singing outside her window. The storm had finally passed during the night, leaving behind a world that sparkled with raindrops in the early morning sun. For a moment, she forgot about everything that had happened. Then she heard a soft movement from near the fireplace and remembered. Ayanna was awake, propped up on his elbow, and staring at her with those intelligent dark eyes. His fever was completely gone now, and there was color in his cheeks again. The boy who'd been half dead yesterday was clearly on the mend. Good morning, Catherine said softly, not wanting to startle him. Morning, he replied carefully, testing out the English word. Then he added something in Comanche that sounded like a greeting. Catherine smiled despite her exhaustion. She dozed fitfully in the rocking chair all night, jerking awake every time the wind rattled the windows or made the cabin creak. Her neck was stiff and her back ached, but seeing Ayanna looking so much better made it all worthwhile. She got up and stirred the coals in the fireplace back to life, then put a pot of water on the boil for coffee. Her morning routine felt strange, with someone watching her every move. It had been so long since she'd shared her space with another person that she'd forgotten how to act normal around company. Are you hungry? She asked, pantomiming eating with her hands. Ayanna nodded eagerly. Yes, very hungry. Catherine laughed. Of course he was hungry. He probably hadn't eaten in 2 days, and his body needed fuel to heal those wounds. She mixed up some cornmeal mush and fried a few strips of bacon from her dwindling supply. The smell filled the cabin and made her own stomach growl. While the food cooked, she helped Ayanna sit up properly. He winced when he moved his splinted leg, but he was definitely stronger than he'd been the night before. She propped him up with pillows and blankets so he could eat more comfortably. "This good," he said after his first taste of the cornmeal mush. "Thank you." They ate in companionable silence for a while. Catherine found herself stealing glances at him, trying to reconcile everything she'd been taught about his people with. The polite, grateful boy sitting in her cabin. Where were the savage instincts she'd heard so much about? Where was the bloodthirsty warrior everyone said lurked inside every Comanche, even the children? All she saw was a kid who said please and thank you and tried not to make a mess while he ate. After breakfast, Catherine cleaned and rebandaged his shoulder wound. It was healing well, no signs of infection, and the bleeding had stopped completely. His leg seemed to be setting properly too, though it would be weeks before he could put any weight on it. "Tell me about your family," she said as she worked. "Do you have brothers, sisters?" Ayanna thought for a moment, searching for the right English words. "One brother, older. He is ... warrior. Strong." He held up his arm to show muscle, then pointed to himself and shook his head sadly. "I am not strong like him." Catherine finished tying the bandage and sat back. "You're stronger than you think. What you went through yesterday would have killed a weaker person." He didn't understand all the words, but he seemed to get the meaning. A small smile crossed his face. "What about your parents?" Catherine asked. Ayanna's expression grew more serious. "Father is chief, important man. Many warriors follow him." He paused, then added quietly, "He worry about me. Think I am dead." Now, the weight of that statement settled over both of them. Somewhere out there, a father was mourning his lost son. A family was grieving. And here that son sat, very much alive, eating breakfast in the cabin of someone his people would consider an enemy. "We'll figure out how to get you back to them," Catherine said gently, "when you're healed enough to travel." But even as she said it, she wondered how that would work. She couldn't just ride up to a Comanche village and drop him off. That would be suicide. And she couldn't send him off alone, on a broken leg. The whole situation seemed impossible, As the morning wore on, Catherine found herself talking to Ayanna more and more. He was hungry to learn English words, pointing at things around the cabin and asking what they were called. She taught him. Chair and table and window. He taught her a few Comanche words in return, though she struggled with the pronunciation. "Catayin," he said slowly, practicing her name. "Why you help me? Your people and my people ... fight." It was a fair question, and one Catherine had been asking herself. "I don't know," she admitted. "I couldn't just leave you there to die. It wouldn't have been right." Ayanna considered this seriously. "My father, he say white people have no honor, but you have honor." Catherine felt a flush of pride at the compliment, followed immediately by a stab of guilt. What would William have thought about all this? Her husband had been part of the local militia, had ridden out more than once to defend settlements from Comanche raids. He'd come home with stories that had given her nightmares, but William had also been a fair man, a kind man. She liked to think he would have done the same thing in her position. Around midday, Catherine heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. She rushed to the window and peered out through the curtains. 3 men on horseback were riding up to her door. She recognized them immediately. Jake Morrison, Pete Williams, and old Doc Henderson from town. "Hide," she whispered urgently to Ayanna. "Someone's coming." The boy's eyes went wide with understanding. He tried to get up, but his broken leg made it impossible to move quickly. Catherine grabbed William's old coat and threw it over him, then piled some quilts on top to make it look like a bundle of laundry. "Don't move," she hissed. "Don't make a sound." The knock on her door came just as she smoothed down her hair and tried to look normal. She took a deep breath and opened it, forcing a smile. Jake! Pete! Doc! What brings you all the way out here? Jake Morrison tipped his hat, but his eyes were already scanning the inside of her cabin. Afternoon, Catherine. We were riding the circuit, checking on folks after that big storm last night. Wanted to make sure you were all right out here by yourself. That's very kind of you, Catherine said, not moving away from the doorway. I'm fine, though. No damage from the storm. Mind if we come in? Pete Williams asked. Been riding since dawn. Could use some coffee if you've got it. Catherine's. Heart pounded, but she couldn't refuse without seeming suspicious. Of course, come in. She led them to the table, as far away from Ayanna's hiding spot as possible. The bundle of quilts by the fireplace looked innocent enough, she hoped. Just like old laundry waiting to be folded, Doc Henderson accepted a cup of coffee gratefully. Hell of a storm last night. Creek's running higher than I've seen it in years. Found a dead horse downstream this morning, all busted up. Indian pony, by the look of it. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee for the other men. Is that so? Probably threw its rider in the flood, Jake said. Good riddance? If you ask me, one less savage to worry about. Jake, Doc Henderson said mildly, the man's probably dead. Good, Jake replied without shame. After what they did to the Patterson family, I got no sympathy for any of them. Catherine forced herself to nod and make appropriate sounds of agreement. Under the pile of quilts, Ayanna lay perfectly still. She could only hope he couldn't understand enough English to know what they were saying about his people. The men finished their coffee and prepared to leave. Jake paused at the door and looked back at Catherine with concern. You sure you're all right out here alone? It's not safe, especially with Indians in the area. You should think about moving back to town. I'll be fine, Catherine said firmly. This is my home, Jake shrugged. Suit yourself. But you keep that rifle loaded, you hear? And if you see anything suspicious, anything at all, you fire 3 shots in the air. We'll come running. After they left, Catherine waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before pulling the quilts off Ayanna. His face was pale and his eyes were full of questions. Those men, he said quietly, they hate my people. Catherine nodded sadly. Yes, they do. There's been too much fighting, too much killing on both sides. People are angry and scared. They would kill me if they knew I was here. Yes, Catherine admitted. They would. And they might kill me too for helping you. Ayanna stared at her for a long moment. Why you take such risk for me? Catherine sat down beside him, suddenly feeling very tired. Because somebody has to try to stop the hatred. Maybe if people like us can find a way to see each other as human beings instead of enemies, maybe the fighting can end someday. It sounded naive even to her own ears, but Ayanna nodded as if it made perfect sense. You are a good person, Catherine. My father, he should know about you. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine found herself hoping that someday, maybe, that could actually happen. Maybe this scared, wounded boy could be the bridge between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. But first, they had to survive long enough for him to heal. And with neighbors like Jake Morrison asking questions, that was going to be harder than she thought. Catherine's eyes snapped open in the gray darkness before dawn. Something was wrong. She'd been living alone on the frontier long enough to trust her instincts. And right now, every nerve in her body was screaming danger. The silence was what woke her. Complete, unnatural silence. No birds singing their morning songs. No insects buzzing. Even the wind that usually rustled through the oak trees around her cabin had stopped completely. It was the kind of silence that meant predators were near. The kind that made every living thing hold its breath and wait. She lay perfectly still in her bed, listening. From his pallet near the fireplace, she could hear Ayanna's soft breathing. The boy had been healing well over the past day. His fever was gone. His wounds were closing cleanly, and he'd been eating everything she put in front of him. But now, in this eerie quiet, even his breathing seemed too loud. Catherine slipped out of bed without making a sound. Her bare feet found the wooden floorboard she knew wouldn't creak, and she moved like a ghost toward the window. The cabin was still dark inside, but outside she could see the first hint of dawn creeping over the eastern hills. She lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to peek out, and her blood turned to ice water. 50 warriors sat motionless on their horses in a perfect half circle around her cabin. Maybe more. She couldn't see them all from this angle. They'd appeared as silently as morning mist, and now they waited with the patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere to run. In the pale dawn light, Catherine could make out the details that made her legs go weak. War paint streaked there, faces and patterns she didn't recognize. Feathers and scalp locks decorated their hair. Some carried rifles, others held bows with arrows already nocked. All of them looked like they'd been carved from stone, utterly still except for their eyes, which missed nothing. At the center of the group sat a man who was clearly their leader. Even from a distance, Catherine could see the elaborate beadwork on his shirt, the eagle feathers in his hair, the way the other warriors looked to him for guidance. This wasn't just any war party. This was a chief, and he brought enough men to level a small town. Catherine's hand went to her throat. She'd heard stories of what happened when Comanche war parties surrounded isolated cabins. The lucky families died quickly. The unlucky ones. She forced herself not to think about that dot behind her. She heard Ayanna stir on his pallet. The sound made her turn, and she saw that he was awake, looking at her with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. "What is wrong?" he whispered in careful English. Catherine's mind raced. Should she tell him? Should she try to hide him again? But there was no point. If these warriors were here for their missing boy, they'd find him no matter what she did. And if they weren't here for him, well, she and Ayanna would both be dead before the sun finished rising. "Your people," she whispered back. "They're here." Ayanna's eyes went wide. He struggled to sit up, wincing as his broken leg moved under the splints. "How many?" 50. Maybe more. The boy's face went pale, but not with fear. With something that looked almost like guilt. "My father," he said quietly. "He came for me." Catherine felt a strange mix of relief and terror. Relief that the boy would be reunited with his family. Terror because she had no idea what that family planned to do to her. "Ayanna," she said softly, "what will he do when he finds out I helped you?" The boy was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his voice was very small. "I do not know. My father, he is good man, but he has much anger. White people killed my uncle last winter. Killed my cousin too." Catherine nodded. She'd heard about that fight. A group of militiamen had attacked a Comanche hunting party, claiming they were raiders. Later, people found out the Indians had just been hunting buffalo, not bothering anyone. But by then it was too late. "So he'll want revenge," Catherine said. "Maybe." Ayanna looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "Or maybe, maybe he will see that you are different." Outside, Catherine heard the soft sound of horses moving. The warriors were shifting position, tightening their circle. Soon they'd be close enough to see into the cabin windows. Close enough to count how many people were inside. Close enough to decide what to do next. "Help me up," Ayanna said suddenly. "I want to see him." Catherine hesitated. Once she helped him to the window, there would be no hiding what she'd done. No pretending she'd never found him, never helped him. The choice she'd made 3 days ago when she pulled him out from under that fallen tree would become final and irreversible. But looking at the boy's determined face, she realized the choice had always been final. From the moment she decided to save his life, this confrontation had been inevitable. She helped him hop to the window on his good leg, supporting most of his weight. When he looked out and saw the warriors surrounding the cabin, his whole body went rigid. "Pia," he whispered, Father Doc Catherine followed his gaze to the chief in the center of the group. Even from this distance, she could see the family resemblance. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, the same proud way of holding his head. This was definitely Ayanna's father, and the expression on his weathered face was terrible. To behold, the chief wasn't just angry, he was grieving. Catherine could see it in the set of his shoulders, the tight line of his mouth. This was a man who'd spent the last 3 days thinking his son was dead, and now he'd come to find the people responsible. "He thinks I'm dead," Ayanna said quietly. "He came here to make someone pay. Will he listen to you? If you tell him what really happened?" Ayanna was quiet for a moment. "Maybe, if I can talk to him before." He didn't finish the sentence, but Catherine understood. Before the shooting started, before anyone did something that couldn't be taken back as they watched, the chief raised his hand and said something in Comanche. Immediately, half the warriors dismounted and began moving toward the cabin on foot. They moved like shadows, spreading out to surround the building completely. In minutes, every exit would be covered. Catherine's mouth went dry. "What are they doing?" "Getting ready," Ayanna said simply. "In case you try to run." The boy looked at her with an expression that was part apology, part determination. "Catherine, you saved my life. Now I try to save yours. But you must do exactly what I say. Understand?" Catherine nodded, though her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold on to him. "When I call out to my father, you must come outside with me. Do not try to hide. Do not reach for your rifle. Keep your hands where he can see them. And let me talk first. What if he doesn't listen? What if he's too angry?" Ayanna was quiet for a moment, watching as his father's warriors took their positions. When he spoke again, his voice was steady but sad. "Then we die together. But at least he will know the truth about what you did. And maybe that will mean something to him." Catherine looked out at the circle of armed warriors, at the chief whose grief had turned to rage, at the sun that was rising on what might be her last day alive. 3 days ago, she'd been a lonely widow hanging laundry and living a quiet life. Now she was about to bet everything on the hope that a Comanche war chief would choose mercy over vengeance. But looking at Ayanna's determined young face, she realized she didn't regret any of it. Not the risk, not the fear, not even the very real chance that she was about to die. She'd saved this boy's life, and in doing so, she'd found something she'd lost when William died, a reason to believe that people could be better than their worst impulses. "All right," she said quietly. "I trust you." Ayanna smiled, and for a moment he looked like the child he really was, instead of the small warrior the frontier had forced him to become. "Then let us go meet my father." Outside, the sun continued to rise, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. In the distance, a meadowlark finally broke the silence with its liquid song. But around Catherine's cabin, 50 armed warriors waited, in perfect stillness for whatever would happen next. The moment of truth had arrived. Catherine's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. Behind her, Ayanna balanced on his good leg, using her shoulder for support. His broken leg made walking impossible, but his determination to face his father was stronger than his. "Pain, remember," he whispered one last time. "Keep your hands where he can see them. Let me speak first. And whatever happens, do not be afraid. Fear makes warriors think you are dangerous." Catherine nodded, though fear was exactly what coursed through her veins like ice water. She'd faced down wild animals, harsh winters, and the loneliness of frontier life. But nothing had prepared her for walking out to meet 50 armed warriors who had every reason to consider her their enemy. She opened the door slowly, and the morning air hit her face like a slap. The smell of horses and leather filled her nostrils. The warriors were close enough now that she could hear their horses breathing, could see the intricate beadwork on their weapons and clothing. Every eye was fixed on her as she stepped onto the wooden porch, supporting Ayanna's weight. The silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then Ayanna spoke. his young voice carrying clearly in the still air. He called out in Comanche, a single word that sounded like a question and a greeting at the same time. The effect was electric. Every warrior straightened in his saddle. Horses shifted and snorted as their riders tensed. And at the center of the group, the chief's face went through a transformation that Catherine would remember for the rest of her life. First came shock. His eyes widened as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then confusion, as his mind tried to process the impossible sight of his son alive and standing with a white woman. And finally, a mix of joy and rage so intense that Catherine took an involuntary step backward. The chief dismounted in one fluid motion and strode toward them, his hand resting on the tomahawk at his belt. He was a big man, taller and broader than Catherine had expected, with graying hair and scars that spoke of a lifetime of battles. His face was painted for war, black and red stripes that made his dark eyes look like burning coals. When he was 10 feet away, he stopped and spoke, rapidly in Comanche. Even without understanding the words, Catherine could hear the emotion in his voice: relief, anger, confusion, and a dozen other feelings all mixed together. Ayanna replied in the same language, his voice calm despite the tension. He gestured to his splinted leg, then to Catherine, then back to himself. He was telling the story, Catherine realized, explaining what had happened and how he'd ended up here. The chief's eyes never left Catherine's face as his son spoke. She forced herself to meet his gaze, remembering Ayanna's warning about showing fear. Those dark eyes seemed to see right through her, weighing her character, judging her intentions. When Ayanna finished speaking, the chief was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the other warriors sat motionless on their horses, waiting for their leader's decision. Catherine could feel their eyes boring into her, could sense the violence that hung in the air like smoke. Finally, the chief spoke. His English was heavily accented but clear, each word carefully chosen. "You found my son dying." It wasn't a question, but Catherine nodded anyway. "Yes, you could have left him to die. Your people and my people are enemies." "Yes," Catherine said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you did not leave him. You brought him to your home. You healed his wounds. You fed him. You protected him from the men who came looking." Catherine's heart skipped. Somehow, he knew about Jake Morrison's visit. Had they been watching the cabin? Had they seen everything? "Why?" the chief asked, stepping closer. "Why risk your life for a Comanche boy?" Catherine looked down at Ayanna, who nodded encouragingly. When she looked back at his father, she spoke the simple truth. Because he needed help. Because he's just a child. Because ... she paused, searching for the right words. Because somebody has to try to stop the killing. The chief studied her face for what felt like an eternity. Then he said something in Comanche to his warriors. Catherine couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the authority in his voice. Whatever he decided, his men would follow. Several warriors dismounted and approached, and Catherine's breath caught in her throat. This was it. Either they were going to kill her, or ... The chief reached into a leather pouch at his waist and pulled out something that made Catherine's eyes widen. It was a necklace made of intricate beadwork, with patterns in blue and white and red that seemed to tell a story. The kind of thing that took months to make, that was passed down through generations. "Among my people," the chief said slowly, "when someone saves the life of our child, they become family. This belonged to my grandmother. She was a healer like you." He stepped forward and placed the necklace around Catherine's neck. The beads were smooth and warm against her skin, and she could feel the weight of tradition and honor in the gesture. "As long as you wear this," the chief continued, "no Comanche warrior will harm you. You are under the protection of my tribe. You are sister to my family." Catherine felt tears running down her cheeks. She hadn't realized she was crying until she tasted the salt. Around them, the warriors who moments before had looked ready to kill, her now watched with something that might have been respect, But the chief wasn't finished. He spoke to one of his men, who led a beautiful painted mare. Forward, the horse was clearly valuable, well-trained, well-fed, with a coat that shined like copper in the morning sun. For the woman with the good heart, the chief said, handing Catherine the reins. You will need a good horse to be safe on this frontier. Catherine took the reins with shaking hands. The mare nuzzled her shoulder gently, as if she understood that her life had just changed hands. Ayanna said something to his father in Comanche, and the older man smiled, the first real smile Catherine had seen from him. He reached out and ruffled his son's hair, the gesture so normal and fatherly that it broke Catherine's heart a little. My son says you taught him English words, the chief said. He says you told him stories about your husband, about your life here. He says you have loneliness in your heart. Catherine nodded, not trusting her voice. The loneliness will pass, the chief said gently. You have shown honor. Honor brings good things in time. As the warriors prepared to leave, taking Ayanna with them, the boy turned back to Catherine one last time. His English had improved dramatically over their few days together, and now he spoke with confidence. I will not forget you, Catherine. I will tell my children about the white woman who saved my life. I will tell them that not all people are enemies. Some are friends we have not met yet. He paused, then added with a grin that reminded her he was still just a boy, and I will practice my English, so when we meet again, I can tell you better stories. The chief helped his son onto a horse, being careful of the splinted leg. As they rode away, Ayanna looked back and waved until they disappeared over the ridge. Catherine stood in her doorway for a long time, holding the reins of her new horse and fingering the beadwork necklace around her neck. The silence that had woken her was gone now, replaced by the normal sounds of morning, birds singing, wind rustling through leaves, water babbling in the creek. But everything had changed. Word would spread quickly through both communities about what had happened here. Some white settlers would call her a traitor for helping an Indian. Some would say she was crazy for taking such a risk. But others, the ones who were tired of the endless cycle of violence, would remember her story. They'd remember that an act of simple kindness had prevented a massacre, had built a bridge between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. Years later, when travelers passed through the area, they'd hear the story of the Comanche treaty woman, the widow who'd saved the chief's son and earned the protection of his entire tribe. They'd hear how she lived in peace on her frontier farm, how Comanche hunting parties would sometimes stop to trade with her, how she became a symbol of what was possible when people chose compassion over hatred. But standing there in the early morning light, Catherine didn't know about the legend she'd become. She only knew that she'd made a choice to see the humanity in a wounded child, and that choice had changed everything. Sometimes, when the world seemed full of nothing but anger and fear, one person's courage to do what was right could light a candle in the darkness. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that candle could start a fire that burned bright enough to show others the way forward. Catherine smiled, scratched her new horse's neck, and went inside to make breakfast. She had a feeling it was going to be a very good day.